RoboQuest, a game about stats, and more stats. One thing that makes games like RoboQuest so fun is the amount of depth and details that they have, but it can be very easy to get lost in a sea of information, which will leave you wondering how things actually work. Hello my friends, it's Khan here, and today we're going over every stat in RoboQuest and discussing the impact each one has on your build. With any roguelites, stats are usually the name of the game. Whether you want to focus on offense or defense, it's important to understand all stats and how they affect your class and your build. This will not only allow you to maximize on your strengths, but will also help you avoid wasting valuable resources and upgrades on stat bonuses that don't benefit you. We will be discussing all stats and their effects based on the roles that they play in the game. We can group all stats into three categories: offensive stats, defensive stats, and elemental stats. Though elemental damage does play an offensive role, we are putting them in their own category due to how significant they are. So with that being said, let's dive in. Beginning with the offense. These stats influence different aspects of weapons and damage dealing skills in the game. I think it's a good idea to quickly cover some basic weapon stats. Some of these may be painfully obvious, but it wouldn't be a complete stat guide without them. First off, the damage stat is of course how much damage each weapon deals to an enemy. As you level up, this stat will continue to increase, as will the effectiveness of the weapon. The fire rate stat will determine how many projectiles a weapon shoots in 1 second. And reload speed of course is how fast the weapon reloads its ammo. Now, the range and radius stat are interchangeable, as the weapon will only have one or the other. The range determines the furthest distance at which a weapon deals its full amount of damage. You can always gauge a weapon's range in battle based on your reticle. When highlighted red, the targeted enemy is within range, but when that reticle fades to gray, the enemy is now out of range and will take less damage. Now, the radius stat affects explosive weapons. It will determine the radius of the projectile's explosion once it hits a target. If the target is within this radius, it will take the weapon's full damage. The next basic weapon stat is the critical multiplier. This determines how much more damage you will deal when triggering a critical strike. This stat can be further broken down into two separate categories: critical hits and auto criticals. You are guaranteed a critical hit when your projectiles hit an enemy weak spot, which in most cases are their glowing red eyes. Auto criticals, on the other hand, is a stat that determines the chances of non-critical hits dealing critical damage. You will notice that some weapons in the game don't have a crit multiplier, and that's because these weapons can't deal crit damage even when hitting an enemy weak spot. But when it comes to auto criticals, these weapons can still deal increased amount of damage despite the weapon's lack of a crit multiplier. Now that we got those basic weapon stats out of the way, let's focus on the remaining offensive stats. The explosion stat affects all weapons and skills that deal explosive damage. If you get an upgrade that grants an additional 10% explosive damage, it will affect all explosive weapons and skills. A similar stat is melee. Just like explosion, the increases you get for the melee stat affects all weapons and skills that contain melee damage. Melee attacks also usually deal high impact, which is a perfect transition for the next stat on the list. Impact is a status effect, and applying enough of it will cause an enemy to stagger in place. And the last of the offensive stats, mark. Marking enemies actually evolves into several different effects depending on your class and upgrades, but at its core, marked enemies take an additional 50% damage from all sources. Now that we've discussed the stats that help you deal damage, let's take a look at the ones that help you avoid it. Of course, starting with the most basic of them all, health and healing efficiency determine the total amount of hit points you have and how much health you receive from healing cells. Next up, we have scratch damage. When taking damage, a portion of your health that is lost is stored as scratch damage. While this isn't super useful at the start of your run, you can obtain items and upgrades that will heal your scratch damage when activated. Now, let's talk about armor. This is a pretty elusive stat in the game. Every class starts out with the same amount of armor, which is 0. Only certain classes can acquire armor upgrades and only a few items granted. Armor reduces how much damage you take from all sources. If you get an item that grants 12% armor, you will take 12% less damage. Next, movement speed is how fast your player moves. Pretty straightforward, but it is one of the most important defensive stats in the game. And for the final defensive stat, head bonk. Yes, another lackluster stat, but for those who are unsure, when you jump on an enemy's head, you trigger a head bonk. This propels you into the air while staggering the enemy below you, leaving you with an opportunity to create some distance and stay moving. Now, let's talk about elemental effects. Elemental damage plays a huge role in the game, and if you plan to beat higher difficulties, understanding them is crucial. Let's discuss burn damage first. Burn deals additional damage over time on top of the damage of your weapon, ability, or perk. This burn damage is dealt over 3.5 seconds. Weapons with the burn affix have a 0.3 burn application rate. This means if a weapon deals 100 damage, it will deal an additional 30 damage over 3.5 seconds. Abilities and perks converted to burn, on the other hand, will have a 0.7 burn application rate. Also, keep in mind when it comes to any items and upgrades that increase elemental effectiveness, plus 10% damage adds 0.1 to the application rate. When it comes to cryo, this element freezes enemies for 6 seconds once enough damage has been dealt. Keep in mind that enemies do have an inherent impact resistance. The higher this resistance, the more cryo you will have to apply to an enemy to freeze them. Enemies are progressively slowed down as cryo is applied until they freeze. Freezing slows an enemy's attack and movement speed by 60%. Cryo will slowly dissipate from an enemy if it's not reapplied. Freezing a boss, on the other hand, will only slow them down 14%. And unlike burn, all items and abilities with the cryo element have a 0.9 application rate, which can also be further increased by upgrades. And finally, when it comes to shock, this element stuns enemies for 3.5 seconds once enough damage has been dealt. And similar to cryo, the higher the enemy's resistance, the more shock you will have to apply to stun them. And another similarity that is shared with cryo, shock slowly dissipates from the enemy if not reapplied, along with having a 0.9 application rate. And there you go. Now you have the knowledge to create some god builds and take you to those higher difficulties. And now that the sea of information that is stats has been conquered, click the video on your screen to check out our latest RoboQuest content and increase your robo knowledge. We appreciate you for sticking around, and thanks for watching.